Good morning, America. Today I want to talk about the Napoleonic Wars. Alright, let's get started. So, the Napoleonic Wars is a direct continuation of the events that began during the French Revolution, which I talked about last week. So, just a quick recap: the French Revolution started in 1789. By 1793, it resulted in the death of King Louis XVI and his wife Queen Marie, and also the deaths of many others during the Reign of Terror, in which Robespierre and Marat and Danton and the Committee of Public Safety had former aristocrats and other enemies of the revolution executed in large numbers. By 1795, there was a reaction against the excesses of the Reign of Terror. Robespierre himself was executed on the guillotine, and the general consensus amongst the revolutionaries was that things had gone too far. The power shifted to a council of sorts called the Directory. However, the Directory was weak and unstable. Also, France was threatened by enemies on all sides, other European countries that did not approve of the French Revolution and were seeking to attack France. Now, in 1799, France underwent another major change in its situation due to the rise of a singularly important individual in world history, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was actually not French, which is extremely ironic. He was from an island called Corsica, which is in the Mediterranean Sea. It is not actually part of France. But as a young man, he joined the French military as an officer, and he rose rapidly through the ranks. In the 1780s, he was an officer in the French military fighting against the other countries that were trying to attack France. And he became very powerful in the French military. The members of the Directory that were running France in the late 1790s looked to him for help to defend the country against its enemies. In 1799, however, Napoleon, in a sense, betrayed the Directory that had trusted him. He seized power in a coup d'etat and he seized power for himself. He, harking back to the vocabulary of the ancient Roman Republic, he declared himself consul, which was not a thing in France up to that point. Napoleon made that up out of thin air. He calls himself consul, and Napoleon would rule over France for the next 16 years. From 1799 through 1803, he was calling himself consul. However, by 1804, he decided that consul was no longer a good enough term for him. He wanted to be emperor. Nothing less than emperor would satisfy him. So in 1804, he became emperor. Who made him emperor, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you asked that. Napoleon made Napoleon emperor, that's who. Napoleon had this big, fancy coronation celebration. It was the biggest, fanciest thing that happened in France for a very long time. And at the coronation ceremony, Napoleon, arrayed in his royal, regal robes, is crowned emperor by himself. He takes the crown and he places it on his own head, in contrast to the old kings of France, who were always historically crowned by the Pope. But no, Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Alright, and then he ruled as emperor until 1815. As emperor, his official title is Napoleon I, of course. Now, what did Napoleon do while he was in charge? Oh, nothing much. Just try to conquer the whole world, or at least Europe. That's what he said about doing. Why did Napoleon want to conquer Europe? Why not? it was there. It was begging to be conquered. So he set out to conquer it, near as I can tell. And in order to do this, he assembled a really first-rate army. Napoleon was very unusual for kings of that day in that he personally commanded his troops in battle. He was a military commander, first and foremost, after all. He personally commands his troops in battle. And when I say command, not just from standing in back, like, yeah, you guys, you go fight, good job there. No, he's right out front, in the front ranks, on a horse, with his sword, charge! Very much like Alexander the Great in that respect. They both had similar leadership styles. And like Alexander the Great, Napoleon inspires absolutely fanatical levels of loyalty and devotion from his men. The army that Napoleon puts together is very good. And they proceed to make mincemeat out of the other armies of other European countries. Napoleon is on a roll. He goes conquering all through Europe. Now, an important point I have to bring up is how Napoleon paid for all this conquest. Well, I'm glad you asked. He built an army, yes, but how he paid for that army was from the Louisiana, I can't spell, Louisiana Purchase. You may remember this from American history. In 1803, Napoleon decided that France no longer had any use for its colonial possessions in North America. Now, France at that time was in possession of a very large swath of North America. In fact, as larger than the United States at the time. The Louisiana Territory was not just the modern-day state of Louisiana. It stretched in kind of a V-shaped formation, starting from Louisiana, but stretching northwards and westward all the way to the Pacific coast. Louisiana, though, wasn't doing much good for France. There was only one city, New Orleans, plus a handful of other small towns and forts. A small fort at a place called Detroit, and a few small settlements in a place called Illinois, but for the most part it was totally uninhabited except by Indian tribes. Napoleon's like, hey, America, would you like to buy this beautiful piece of howling wilderness I've got here? Oh, and it's got one cool city in it too, New Orleans. And America's like, yeah, actually. Because President Thomas Jefferson was big on farming. He thought that he loved farmers. He was one, after all. And he especially liked the type of farming where the slaves do all the work for you, though. But he's big on farming and farmers, and he wants to make sure that America has lots of farmland for years to come. And so Jefferson kind of was really into this proposal of America buying Louisiana. Now, Jefferson had his doubts whether the Constitution would let America do that, but he decided it was in America's best interest, so he did it anyway. So America bought Louisiana from France. I can never remember exactly how much it was. I think it was about $25 million. Don't hold me to the exact number. You can Google that if you want, but about $25 million. But the important thing was the United States paid in gold, solid gold. That's what Napoleon used to conquer Europe with. That infusion of gold without one purchase. Napoleon had all the money he could possibly need to conquer Europe. So the United States got Louisiana, and Napoleon got a whole bunch of money they used to conquer Europe with. Now, personally, I think the United States got the better end of the bargain because we still have Louisiana and Napoleon doesn't still have Europe. But, well, in any case, so he sets out to conquer Europe. And so it's basically, there's this war, it's called the Napoleonic Wars. It's plural, wars, not war, because there were some pauses along the way. So technically it's more than one war, but who cares? So It's basically the Napoleonic Wars, and even though technically there was more than one, we basically view them all together. It's basically Napoleonic France versus every other country in Europe. Until they get conquered, that is. So it's France versus Italy until Italy gets conquered. And it's France versus Prussia until Prussia gets conquered. That happened at the Battle of Jena, which looks like Jena, but I believe it's Jena, in 1806, in which Napoleon and the French forces mopped the floor with Prussia. And it's Napoleon versus England consistently, virtually the whole time, though French forces never set foot in England because of that annoying quirk of geography where England is an island. So the French forces can't actually march there, so they never actually get to England, but the French and English navies battle it out on the high seas. And it's France versus Russia, though that one's a little complicated because for a while Russia tried to make nice with Napoleon and they had a treaty. And then Russia decided, you know what, there's no point in being friends with this dude. We're going to have to fight him sooner or later. May as well be sooner. Excuse me, and so they go back to war with him. Now, Napoleon consistently conquers. He took Germany, he took Italy, he took Spain, though in Spain, the Spanish people didn't like being conquered very well, and there is a long-running guerrilla war. Not gorilla like but guerrilla meaning low-level partisan warfare. In fact, this is where the term guerrilla comes from. It's from the Spanish word for war, which is a huge thorn in Napoleon's side because it ties down large numbers of French troops trying to beat the Spanish rebels when they could be more usefully fighting elsewhere. But he defeats Spain, he defeats Prussia, he defeats Italy, he defeats Austria. He's basically ascendant everywhere. The only ones that he couldn't conquer were England because he couldn't walk there. Basically, his armies are triumphant anywhere they can march to, but he can't march to England. And Russia. Russia turns out to be too big of a nut to crack. In the early 1814, I think, Napoleon decides that 1813, Napoleon decides that he is going to take out Russia once and for all. So he gets a massive army together. It was called the Grand Armée. And he sets out to invade Russia. He invades Russia, and he thinks that this is going to be very easy. So easy, in fact, that he thinks it can be done in a single year. Now, Russia's military is not strong enough to keep Napoleon at bay, so the Russian army just keeps retreating and retreating and retreating in advance of him without ever actually coming to battle. All right, Napoleon and his men finally make it to Moscow. And Napoleon is bent on conquering Moscow. He thinks if I can take Moscow, then the Russians will surely give up. Well, the Russians had other ideas. Rather than allow Moscow to fall into Napoleon's hands, they burn the whole city of Moscow to the ground, and then they retreat out the other end. So yeah, Napoleon takes Moscow, which is a smoldering pile of ashes. And yet it doesn't do him any good. Russia doesn't surrender. They still have an army. They're still going to keep on fighting. Oh, and another thing. You know what happens in Russia every year around November, December, even October? Yeah, it's called winter. And Napoleon and his men are now stuck in Russia in the winter without proper clothing because he thought he was going to win before winter came. Napoleon finally wakes up to the trouble he's in, and he says, okay, boys, let's pack it up. Let's head home. and they begin the long, slow walk back to France in the bitter cold, being chased by the Russian army. More of Napoleon's men died from the cold on their way back to France than died in combat with the Russians. The majority of the men who set out with Napoleon to Russia never came back again. The following spring, the emaciated, bedraggled, shivering remains of Napoleon's army come limping back to France with the Russians hot on their heels. And the Russians chase Napoleon all the way back to France. Then they invade France. They occupy Moscow. And it's all over. It's done. Or so they thought. Now, Napoleon is forced to surrender to the Allies. That's what the European countries are called who came against him. Is forced to surrender to the Allies. They sent him into exile. They sent him into exile on an island in the Mediterranean called Elba. Not Elbow, but Elba, which is just off the coast of Italy in the Mediterranean. And then all the kings and queens of Europe had a big party called the Congress of Vienna. Okay, well, it wasn't first and foremost a party. It was first and foremost a diplomatic meeting. Because basically, Napoleon, think of Europe as like a plate. Or maybe like a jigsaw puzzle. Napoleon took the puzzle and he threw it on the floor, broke it into pieces, then rearranged all the pieces to make his own picture. Okay, now that Napoleon's out of the way, the kings and queens of Europe are going to have to put the puzzle back together again properly, which means putting all the right people back on the right thrones, because Napoleon had a habit of putting his friends and relatives on the thrones of all the places that he conquered. But now, Napoleon's friends and relatives have to be booted out, and the proper people have to be put back on the throne instead. So they have a big meeting called the Congress of Vienna to figure that out. But it was also a big party. Now, as they're in the middle of partying at Congress of Vienna, Napoleon is happily embracing his life of exile in Elba. No, just kidding, not at all. Napoleon is not content to sit on the island of Elba. He gets his hands on a boat, a small rowboat of some sort, and he makes a perilous sea crossing from Elba back to Italy. He stages a daring, to France, he stages a daring escape. He lands in southern France and he's like, I'm back, you miss me? Yeah? And then all the men who used to be his soldiers are like, Napoleon, you're back, we missed you so much. You're gonna lead us to glory now, right? And Napoleon is like, yes, on to glory. And so Napoleon escapes from Elba and stages this dramatic return. And his return is sometimes called the 100 Days, because for 100 days after his escape from Elba, Napoleon was once again on the loose in Europe, and in France. And in that time period, he raised a new army made up of all the surviving veterans of his old army. And so they're busy partying at Vienna, and suddenly the word comes, Napoleon's back, and oh, guess what? He's got another army again. And all the European countries are like, oh, really? Do we have to do this again? Okay, fine. Where's my army? Let's go fight this guy. And so they have one final battle called the Battle of Waterloo. And this is the battle to end all battles, so the Napoleonic Wars. And it's Napoleon and his veterans one last time versus all the other countries of Europe. And they have the battle, and Napoleon loses. The Allies win, and the glorious return, the glorious 100 Days is done for. The Allies take Napoleon and they're like, okay, we're going to send you somewhere that you're never coming back from. And so this time, they sent him into exile on an island called St. Helena. St. Helena is a isolated, forsaken lump of rock in the middle of the southern Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from Africa and thousands of miles from South America, and even more thousands of miles from Europe. And the European allies are like, I bet you'll stay this time. And he did. There was no escape from St. Helena. And Napoleon lived out the rest of his days in a house on St. Helena. My understanding is he took long walks on the beach and thought about his glory days as emperor. And there he died. And that, boys and girls, is the story of the Napoleonic Wars. See you later.